Okay, I think we'll get started. So thank you everyone for joining today's didactic training session. Just a quick reminder that today's presentation will be recorded and posted to the Transcend website so you can view it later. And after the presentation, we will have time for a question and answer session when you can either ask questions directly or add the questions to the chat. And at the end of today's presentation, we'll also share a link to a short survey. Your feedback is extremely helpful in shaping future sessions, so we really appreciate you taking a couple minutes to complete the survey. And finally, I want to remind you that our next didactic training will be held on Tuesday, March 10th at 12 p.m. The topic will be identifying legitimate research journals and key considerations before submission, presented by Sarah Westall and Sandy Bates. And we look forward to seeing you there as well. And with that, we'll get started. Welcome again to today's training titled Writing Scientific Grants. We are fortunate to have Dr. Lee Baugh leading today's presentation. Dr. Baugh is an established leader in psychology and neuroscience with a strong foundation in cognitive neuroscience research, specifically in understanding skilled movement and clinical conditions of stroke, post-traumatic stress disorder, and alcohol use disorders. Currently, he is the director of Human Functional Imaging Core, the Center for Genetics and Behavioral Health, and the Center for Brain and Behavior Research. In these roles, he has secured approximately $5 million in direct research funding and $12.2 million for broader academic projects. He has experience with major research infrastructure grants and NIH training awards, combined with extensive involvement in NIH, COBRI, and CTR grants, including directing the Professional Development Core of the Dakota CTR. In these roles, he has fostered the professional development of neuroscience students and faculty, including 33 undergraduate and 28 graduate, medical, and MD, PhD students, as well as faculty across 3 institutions within the Great Plains region. Please welcome Dr. Lee Baugh.
All right, thank you, Kent, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for tuning in, and to Dr. Wunderlich and the Professional Development Corps for inviting me to tell you a little bit about writing scientific grants. So the first thing that I want to state right from the start is that this isn't going to be a how to format NIH sections talk. There's a lot of online resources, there's a lot of guidebooks to say effective methods of doing that. What I hope to convey through this talk is more to let you in to how reviewers think and how decisions are made, and how, as a grant writer, you can signal readiness to those reviewers that, hey, if you give me this money, good things are going to happen. So as a sort of aside to that, I would recommend for early career investigators that haven't checked out the program yet, definitely look into NIH's Early Career Researcher and Reviewer program. So this is an opportunity for individuals that are early in their NIH career to be put on study sections as a reviewer with a limited workload and without having that firsthand successful grant experience that's normally required. I did this many years ago, and it was a great introduction to how NIH review actually works. And just seeing it from the inside was really useful in crafting my grants moving forward. And I think it would do the same for a lot of other individuals as well. So we're certainly looking to that NIH Early Career Reviewer program. The only requirements are that you have submitted an NIH grant and have received feedback. So it doesn't have to be scored or anything like that. They just want to make sure that you've gone through the process once, and then you can join this. And like I said, it was a great experience. So definitely recommend looking into that. The other thing that I really want to stress from the start is that most grants, especially early career grants, don't fail because the idea is bad, but rather that the narratives or the RFA that they're targeting are misaligned. So with that in mind, grant writing really is more of a skill than a talent. There are some people that are very, very gifted writers. There's no denying that, but everyone can learn how to align their research to these mechanisms in a compelling way. So it is something that can be learned. So if you feel like you're not a great writer, that's perfectly fine. There are steps that you can take to still check off the boxes that a reviewer is looking for. Just as a little bit of background, and I think Kent did a great job with the introduction, to give a little bit of credibility and also to put things into perspective for why I'm here talking in front of you all. I do have a lot of experience writing grants. I tallied it up just the other day, 134 grants I have written since I came here in 2012. And a small proportion of those were successful. And that's the first thing that I want to stress here. It is not the case that even as you gain a lot of experience writing these, that you're expecting to get something funded on the first submission. That is certainly not the way it works. Especially when you're starting off, it's important to have that perseverance and just to view those comments that you get back as an opportunity to learn and to strengthen rather than get completely disheartened and say, well, grant writing and funded research is not for me. I have had experiences with NIH, DoD, NSF, state mechanisms, foundation grants, ranging from individual PI applications all the way to very large center grants. So just about everything that you can ask money for, at some point, I've written a grant to ask money for it. Because of that experience, I've also had a fair bit of practice on internal grant groups. I'm more than willing to read colleagues' grants and give feedback and things of that nature. I think those sorts of activities can play a huge role in grant development as well. The next thing that I just wanted to quickly cover is the differences between NIH versus some of these other funding bodies like NSF or foundations. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on that because it's really not the focus of this presentation, but just to, when you're thinking about potential targets for your research idea, knowing a little bit about what they're really looking for can help guide that decision. So with NIH, their primary goal, as you can imagine, is to improve human health. So because of that, they have an emphasis on the significance of the research, which we'll talk about in a few moments, the rigor and the feasibility. So basically, is this project going to be able to get done? Their reviews are quite conservative and criteria driven. So other than a few key mechanisms, NIH does not typically like what's considered risky research, which means that preliminary data is often expected. They do strongly value team science. The days of the single PI NIH R01 are dwindling quickly. Those sorts of mechanisms are far less likely to be funded than they were 15 years ago. Translation is, of course, explicitly expected because they're interested in improving human health. The way that you go about that is through translation, and their subsequent risk tolerance you would describe as moderate to low. So they don't like risky science unless it's a specific granting mechanism that is a call for those sorts of risky projects. In comparison, NSF's main goal is to advance fundamental knowledge. So you can think of this as science for the sake of science. They're very interested in innovation, theory, broader impacts of the work. So their review style is following that with reviews concerned more about the conceptual and idea forward sorts of projects. So one of the things that we see in NSF all of the time are projects that are failing because their theoretical background isn't strong enough or innovative enough, which usually isn't something that NIH is particularly concerned with. The preliminary data with NSF grants is often minimal, and the inclusion of teen science is variable depending on the project, but I would say it's less emphasized in NSF than it is in NIH. The translation of an NSF grant is often indirect. There have been hundreds of millions of dollars of commercial ventures that have spun out of NSF projects, but that's not what they're funding for the majority of granting mechanisms. So these ancillaries are often indirect. And then their risk tolerance is a little bit higher. If you have strong theory, if you make a good case for why you think that this research is important, NSF is more likely to fund it without pilot data and with it being a somewhat risky proposition, especially compared to NIH. And then foundations are sort of a different beast altogether. They are always mission-driven impact, so they are assessing whether what you're proposing is going to fulfill the mission of their foundation, which results in an alignment, urgency, and outcome emphasis. There is no point submitting to a foundation where there isn't that tight alignment between what you're doing and what their mission is, because they are just not going to fund that. Their review style is much more narrative and story driven. They have a lot more flexibility. Preliminary data is variable here. Sometimes they like it, sometimes they don't, and it really depends on what the foundation is, and again, what's aligning with what their goals are for that call. Team science is often required in foundation grants, especially in RFAs where they are looking to form teams around research questions. Not only do they want to fund your research, but they want to make sure that what you're doing is going to fit in with their larger, broader portfolio. And as part of that, sometimes they make explicit pairings of researchers and say, well, you guys are now working together on this issue. Translation is frequently applied, and then their risk tolerance is going to be variable. So some foundations are fairly risk averse, other ones are fairly risk tolerant. So what that means is oftentimes we're looking to take our project and change it as we go across funders. And it can sort of sometimes feel like that shell game where you have, that little red ball that's representing your research, and then you're shuffling it amongst these shells as you're pitching it to these various funding agencies. The thing to keep in mind here is that you're changing your voice when you're doing this, not your science. So the core of the program should remain the same. What you're doing is changing your sales pitch to these various entities. With NIH, they're really concerned about that pathway between mechanism, clinical relevance, and then the next translational step. So that's going to be a focus on reassurance that the work can be done and the rigor of the science. NSF, on the other hand, is more interested in these broad conceptualizations and advancing theoretical stipulations. So generalizable principles that lead into broader impacts. So they want ideas and general knowledge. Foundations, they are usually working under an urgent need. So either they've received a donation or the entire foundation is set up to address this pressing health need. They want actionable outcomes and scalability. So that, again, mission alignment and urgency really plays into how those grants are being reviewed and should play into how you're writing them. With a lot of early career investigators, at least what I've seen when I've been reviewing, is it's apparent that they are recycling the same grant. And again, it's okay to repurpose your grant for these different mechanisms, but you can't submit the same grant and expect it to be successful. So you really have to reframe it, and that reframing is a really core academic skill that we encounter in all sorts of avenues. So whether it's pitching a research grant or pitching a paper or a presentation to various audiences, this is something that comes up time and time again. But the question that you always have to ask yourself in these situations is, what would a reviewer for this funder care about the most? And that's what I've tried to outline here. If you can answer that question and craft your grant to fulfill that need, your chances of it being favorably reviewed go up quite a bit. The next thing that I think is important to cover is how reviewers actually read grants. So by that, what I mean is when we're writing it, we're expecting someone to go from the first page that we write to the end of the application in this very linear fashion. And the fact of the matter is, this is very seldom how grants are actually reviewed from the reviewer's perspective. They are certainly overworked, especially, and I'll talk about this near the end of the presentation, but especially currently with all of the crunch that NIH is experiencing due to the trying to catch up from the shutdown. They are certainly underpaid, and they are typically reading your grant at the last minute possible, usually in the middle of the night. When we used to fly to Bethesda to do these grant reviews, it was usually on the plane as we were heading there. So it's not this linear approach. So you want to make sure that your individual components are getting the points across that they need to, not assuming that they've either read something else or that they even will read something else as they're going through and reviewing your grants. So what that means is that most reviewers are forming, in their head at least, a preliminary score right after the specifics aims page. They are going to do a quick skim of the specifics aims page and read the significance and innovation. And once they've sort of got in their head where they're thinking this grant is going to land, it's very, very difficult to change their opinion. Once this mental model forms, the rest of the grant they're reading to either confirm or disconfirm that impression, and usually the bias is on confirming. So if you get a great start and you wow them with that specific aims page, you're in a good position. The rest of the time they're going into it thinking that you are going to be able to carry through that excellence that's presented in the specifics aims page throughout the rest of the grant. And this will come up time and time again, and I'm sure you've all heard it multiple times. The specifics aims page is where grants live or die. And they certainly deserve all of the effort and all of the time that you can possibly put towards crafting those to be the most convincing that they can. Another thing to keep in mind is that when a reviewer is reading these things, they're not trying to determine if you're brilliant or not. And I think sometimes as a grant writer, we go into it thinking, well, if I paraphrase things like this, or if I set out my arguments like this, the reviewers are going to just be astounded by my brilliance and it's going to be excellent. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is trying to determine whether you're safe to fund. And that's a big difference. You can have some ideas that are absolutely brilliant, but if it comes off as being a risky proposition to actually fund that grant, or if you're cutting corners or leaving things out of the grant because you spend so much time trying to convince the reviewers how smart you are, that's going to leave a negative impression. So we'll come back to the specifics aims page in a few slides, but that's just something that I wanted to highlight right from the start. This fact that your score is driven very early in the review process. The next question that people often ask is, well, what actually makes research translational? And the nice thing with NIH is that they do have pretty good definitions as to what counts. The negatives to that is their definitions can be pretty convoluted at times. And I have known many a faculty member read through those and say, well, I mean, they're talking a lot, but I still don't really know what they mean. Basically, from the reviewer standpoint, what they're looking for is human relevance, a clear path forward, and real world impact. If you can fit those three check boxes into your grants and convince reviewers that this is something that you're able to do, it's going to hit well as translational research. What that means is that it's not defined by techniques, it's defined by trajectory. And a lot of times people make the assumption that if I'm doing a certain type of research using this certain methodology or this certain piece of equipment, clearly it's translational research. And that's not the case. What you want to do as a grant writer is ask yourself, well, what human problem is motivating this work? Why is it important? What changes if this study is done? And by answering those questions, that's where you can start to ensure that your grant is going to be reviewed as making a translational impact. Many junior investigators really undersell this translation because they fear like they might be overpromising. And I certainly did this when I first came to South Dakota here and started writing my first few grants, I had two strikes against me. One of them, I had never written an NIH grant before because I was coming from Canada and we have entirely different funding systems. And second, Canadian funding systems and Canadians in general, we don't like to boast about a whole lot of things. So there was this really almost like a dirty feeling that I would get when people would tell me, you really have to bump up and really promise that this research is going to do all of these wonderful things. It made me feel sort of like a used car salesman. But that is the truth in grants, especially at the NIH. Reviewers are going to be looking for that level of translation and say that you have this real world impact and you want to package it in a way that's nice and digestible. Reviewers are also going to penalize a grant that fails to articulate the next step. And I'll talk about this again when we talk about common reviewer critiques, but they want to see, again, that this research project is fitting into a trajectory of going from wherever we are currently in the field to a real world impact. And a big part of that is you specifically stating how you're going to take this research project once it's completed and move it to that next step. That's an especially important part of that translational spectrum. So the strong sort of framing questions that you should be asking yourself is, why this problem? Why should we study it? Why should we do it now? And why should I or my team be the one that's doing it? If you can answer those three questions with a fair amount of certainty, the grant is going to be reviewed well, at least on that translational aspect. So one of the things that I suggest people do to get at this is really practice describing their work's relevance in a sentence or two without any jargon. If you can do that, and generally the easiest way to do that is to describe why should we do this now? Why is it a problem? And why are we the ones to do it? You're in a pretty good spot. So I'm going to return to the specifics aims page, and I'm sure you've all seen at one point or another the skeleton where you introduce the problem, you introduce the gap, you talk about your hypothesis, you talk about your aims, and then you talk about the impact that the research is going to have. As I said before, this is going to be, and I'll go even further with it, I would say that the specifics aims page for those that are doing health-related research is going to be the most important page of your career. You will write many of them. They will be the thing that decide how successful you are as a researcher. Reviewers are often not only reading the specifics aims page as a start and then sort of setting where they think that the score should be. Oftentimes, we go back to the specifics aims page after our discussion at study section and then use it to justify a score. So you have another opportunity there to sort of influence those decisions. Again, it's very important that your specifics aims page is strong. And what makes a strong aims page? Well, you want it to complete or tell a complete story. And by that, what I mean is it should almost stand alone. You should be able to have someone read your specifics aims page and get all of the information that they need to be able to make a pretty good assessment as to the quality of this project. Oftentimes, what we see, especially with early career investigators, is they use the specifics aims page as a summary. So they'll write the entire grant, they go back to the specifics aims page, and they just summarize what they're doing in the rest of the grant. I would suggest that that's the wrong approach. The specifics aims page you should treat as an argument. This is your pitch for why you should be funded. Along with that, you want to keep in mind that clarity is always going to beat complexity. And that's what we see when the aims page is generated after the rest of the grant is we see these complex methods creeping their way in. And while you certainly do have to talk about how you're going to do the research in the aims page, clarity is always going to beat complexity. So you want fewer aims, cleaner logic, that's always going to score better. So you want to make sure that that's something that you are doing right from the onset and not just use it as a summary. When it comes to writing the aims themselves, you do want them to be independent, you want them to be outcome focused, and you want them to be question driven. So aims should be framed as an answerable scientific question, not as this packaging up of the work in the rest of the grant. You want to avoid certain words like to characterize or to explore or to establish. These are sort of keywords that reviewers pick up on and say, you don't really know what you're going to get out of this. You can characterize a million things in a million different ways. They have to be much more, as the name would suggest, specific than that. Each aim should produce a decision relevant outcome. By the end of this, we are going to learn something that is going to inform either the next steps of the grant or the next steps of the research as a whole. So to do that, your aims don't need to solve the entire problem. Oftentimes we think that if we, by the end of a specific aim one, we haven't completely addressed this question, it's not going to be a strong aim. What we want to do is promise that we're going to be pushing the field forward. That's what reviewers are looking for. They're not looking for it to answer every question that there is about whatever it is that you're doing. There is also the important consideration about interdependability across aims. If, for example, aim 2 entirely depends on aim 1 succeeding, reviewers are going to flag this as risky, and I'm sure this is something that you've heard before as well. The way around that, and it is possible to have interdependent aims, and very strong specific aims pages can do this, but you want to make sure that you still learn something useful if that aim fails. And that's where it really comes down to, again, avoiding those wishy-washy verbs and making sure that the outcome, either way it goes, you're going to get something that you are going to be able to carry forward, and all of the money that NIH just gave you isn't wasted. For the significance of the grant, here we're looking at a combination of the disease burden, the knowledge gap, and the consequences of inaction. It's not background. Oftentimes we see it written as the background. It's the motivation for why you're doing the grant. While reading this, reviewers want to feel and get a good sense for why the work needs to be done. Oftentimes, in grants that are coming from less experienced grant writers, we see that they spend too much time on general disease facts and not enough on that specific knowledge gap. So, for example, in my case, we all know if I'm writing a grant to NIH to cover stroke work, stroke is bad. It has bad consequences. It's expensive. It causes people to have long-term disabilities. I don't And I shouldn't try and convince the reviewers that stroke is bad. We all know that. What I need to do is briefly introduce the scale of the disease state as a whole, and then focus in on the specific gap that my research application is targeting, and talk about all of the negative consequences of if this specific project isn't funded, not if stroke research as a whole doesn't make progress. So a strong significance section is going to explicitly state what we don't know, why that matters, and what happens if we don't fix it. And this is your ability to really shine and say how you're a leader in this area, even if you have less experience than some of the people that you may be competing with, because you are demonstrating that you are the expert in this knowledge gap area. You may not be the most experienced in, again, as the example of being stroke, in stroke overall, but for this specific niche where we're targeting our research, no one does this better, and we're in the best position to answer that question. So again, it's not background, it's the motivation for why the work is important. For innovation, a lot of times people go into thinking that the innovation is going to be we can put a check mark beside it if no one's ever thought of this before, or no one's ever done this before. Innovation can be certainly conceptual, methodological, and integrative, but it doesn't automatically mean that this project is innovative just because no one's ever done it. So you want to be able to clarify that it's a new way of thinking about something, or a new application of a technology or a technique that's there, or a new integration of research fields that are now allowing you to advance the field forward. Oftentimes, junior investigators underclaim innovation, again, out of more caution than anything else. But reviewers expect even grants coming from early career investigators to be innovative within reason, but if there still has to be something new that's being added. And you can't sell it just by saying, well, no one's ever done this before, so we're innovative. So a more useful framing is saying that the project is innovative because it changes how we understand or approach this condition, not just because it uses a new method or because no one's done it before. The other thing to say about innovation is that it should appear throughout the grant. Sometimes we have our innovation section, we get as much in there as we can, and then we move on and never touch it again. I would suggest that that's a poor approach. You want to remind reviewers throughout the grant that, oh yeah, this is something that hasn't been done before. So it's okay to talk about the innovation when you're talking about your research design or your analysis or those later sections, just to say, again, what's really new about what you're doing. Rigor and feasibility within the approach are sections that have gained more and more emphasis over the years, especially at NIH. Here, reviewers are looking at things like your design, your power calculations, bias mitigation. I like to view this section as your opportunity to justify to the reviewers that you can trust me with this money. I have thought about things enough. I have set up the experiment in such a way that if you give me this money, it will not be a waste. Along these lines, reviewers are not going to be impressed by overly complex designs. What they want to see are an alignment between aims and methods, a realistic recruitment, and clear analytic plans. On the early career investigators side, we often see that they avoid discussing limitations because they feel like if they bring up a problem, now it's going to sort of hamstring them for funding. And it's certainly not the case. Explicitly addressing the potential problems or the pitfalls or whatever you want to name that statement in a grant increases the reviewer's confidence that you've thought this through. Now, of course, the ancillary to that is you have to make sure that if you identify a problem or a potential pitfall, that you have realistic methods of dealing with it. You don't want to just say, oh, and if this happens, we're just going to throw our arms up in the air and stick our heads down and wallow for the next 3 years. You need to convince them that you've thought about it, you've devised strategies to address those problems, and the grant will succeed even if we encounter this potentially negative circumstance. So the feasibility is really about planning and being able to convince the reviewers that even though you've designed this study and you think everything is going to work out in this certain way, we've thought ahead, and if these other circumstances do arise, we have a viable solution to dealing with those circumstances as well. Again, convincing the reviewers that, hey, you can trust me with this money, it's not going to be a waste. When it comes to team science, this is another thing that's gaining more and more traction, especially at NIH. And the things that especially early career investigators want to pay attention to is ensuring that your team has complementary expertise, that there's clear roles, and that there's a strong leadership plan. I was surprised the first time I was in a study section where leadership plans came up and they were discussed to the level that they were. Reviewers are looking at who's doing what, who's leading, and whether their expertise is an appropriate match to the aim. Oftentimes, as an assistant professor or junior faculty or a faculty member without a lot of research experience, when you start bringing on these much more senior collaborators, you start worrying that they're going to overshadow your contributions. You know, I'm on this grant with so-and-so, and they are the biggest name in this field. It's going to make it look like I'm not doing anything. And that is a valid concern. And the way that you deal with that is by emphasizing your leadership, by, again, clearly defining roles, positioning those collaborators as enabling the work, not directing the work, and making sure that the team science package as a whole is intentional and not compensatory. So this team was formed for a reason. This is why these are the best people to be doing this, and this is how we're going to ensure that we function as a team towards those goals. For aligning with the FOA, it seems rather obvious, but again, I oftentimes am reviewing grants where this doesn't happen. You want to echo the language that is used in the FOA. They will have criteria, they will have things that they are looking for. You want to make sure that you're using those same words. I've seen many grants fail or review poorly because they're just misaligned. It was a good idea, and as a review panel, we could see how this could potentially fit in with the mechanism that they submitted for. That's why it's there, but the writer themselves did not do a great job of making that case. So as a reviewer, you're explicitly asked, does this application address the FOA? And if we have to do the work for you, that's automatically going to make us feel like there's something missing with this grant, that it shouldn't score as highly, they haven't thought about it enough. So you want to mirror that FOA language, and you want to directly incorporate the review criteria into your grant. And I've heard this described before as gaming the system. You know, we're taking their own words and using it against them, or however you want to think of that. I mean, it's just not. This is what professional grant writing is. This is how you do that. All of your competitors are going to be doing that same thing, and it's going to look weird if you do not. So some examples of this are, if the FOA is emphasizing workforce development, make sure that you have terms in there that are related to workforce development. It's happening less and less, but a common one a few years ago was diversity. If that was something that the FOA was targeting, make sure that you include those words. Now I have to give the stipulation, it's probably best that you remove those words from your grant under the current review structures. So that's also an example of matching what the FOA is emphasizing and what they're looking for with your grant. So in the last few slides, I'd like to talk about some of the common reviewer critiques that we see. These are ones that I've both received as a grant writer and also have given as a grant reviewer. The three that I think are the most common are overly ambitious, unclear hypotheses, and weak feasibility. Because these are predictable and we have a fairly good understanding that going into it, these are likely to come up, that means that they're largely preventable. So overly ambitious, usually what the reviewers is talking about is the scope doesn't match the timeline or the resources. An unclear hypothesis is usually reflecting that the writing is perhaps not as clear as it should be. It's usually not a critique of the thinking, and that's an important distinction. Feasibility concerns are often a result of missing details. So again, it's not that we don't think that that project can be done, it's that you haven't presented enough information to convince us that that project can be done. So those are just things to keep in mind. And again, because we know that they're so common, you can do some work on the front end to try and prevent that. So an example of that is, again, with this overly ambitious critique. And this is the one that I receive more than any other. And it's the one that I see in grant panels more than any other. And again, it's just about scope mismatch. So when they say that it's overly ambitious, they're usually talking about too many aims for the time period, methods that don't match the available resources, or expectations that are exceeding the primary data or your preliminary data. So it's not that the idea is bad. It's not that your question is unimportant. It's that you are biting off more than you can chew in one or all of these areas. And the way that early career investigators often respond to this is then by adding more justification or trying to defend their ambition, and that never reviews well. If a panel of reviewers or your primary and secondary and tertiary reviewers have decided that this is overambitious, on that resubmission, you're not going to convince them that it isn't. So what you want to do to fix it is reduce the number of aims. Don't downplay the importance of the problem. Just tighten those outcomes instead of expanding your methods, and frame this grant as a critical step towards that full solution that perhaps you were seeking the first time around in that initial submission, and reduce the scope to ensure that it's now something that reviewers are going to view as a attainable goal. So the thing to highlight here again is that reviewers are looking to fund research trajectories, not entire careers in one award. So you want to make sure that you are not, again, biting off more that you can chew. The last few slides, I want to talk about another thing that I think there's a lot of confusion about, and that's what it's like working with program officers, and the misunderstandings about what a role a program officer has in a grant and in that funding decision. So the first thing to highlight is they do not change scores. They can influence funding decisions, but they're really looking to fund science between the scores, not instead of them. So if you have a range of scores that are considered fundable, their role is to work within that range to identify the strongest applications or the ones that are the best fit. They are not going to do things like rewrite your grant or lobby reviewers on your behalf or override those peer review scores. So it's really important before you even make that initial submission to reach out to the program officer, and you can ask them a fair number of questions that can save you a lot of time. In some cases, years or months of effort. So you can ask them about the fit. Of course, you don't want to ask about funding promises. You do want to be concise and specific. These are very busy individuals, especially now. So you want to frame your questions strategically and respect their time and start building a rapport. Oftentimes, you're submitting to this same study section time and time again. You don't want to be the person that the program officer sees when it shows up on their caller ID or in their Outlook or their Outlook inbox, but they're like, oh, geez, here comes so-and-so again. You want it to be a pleasant interaction and make sure that you're not asking them questions that they're going to perceive as being inappropriate or things that they can't do anything about. So some safe questions that you can ask before a submission is something like, does this fit the mission and the priorities? Is the scope appropriate? Would you recommend this FOA as a good home for this grant? Or is there something better that's out there? Are there specific aspects that I should clarify for reviewers? And is the level of preliminary data that I'm providing appropriate for this mechanism? Those are certainly questions that you can ask ahead of time. After you get feedback, you can certainly contact the program officer and say, how should I interpret these critiques? They're involved in the discussions, and they get an insight that may not make it into that summary statement. So it's important to reach out and see if there's anything sort of between the lines that you need to be aware of. You can ask if they feel like it would be competitive for resubmission. Now, program officers are very, very unlikely to say, do not submit your grant here. They are told not to do that, but they can say whether they view it as being competitive or not. They can certainly ask if, or you can certainly ask them if you feel like, if now that I've got reviews back, is it a better fit somewhere else now that we're seeing how reviewers are reviewing it? What critiques are most critical to address? And then one that's particularly important in these idea states is there institute interest despite the score? So there are pots of money that are available to idea states to fund grants that were considered meritorious, but not within that funding range. But the program officer has to actively seek out those mechanisms. It doesn't happen automatically. And what this means is, again, if you can get that discussion going with the program officer and say, yeah, I know it didn't score all that well. Is it something that the institute is interested in? And then you can use that as a bridge to remind them that coming from an idea state, there are these other mechanisms that they may want to look at. It's entirely dependent on the program officer as to whether they do that or not. We've seen successes and we've seen failures, and that's about all I can say in that regard. Questions that you want to avoid are things like, do you think I'll get funded? Or can you talk to the reviewers and convince them about how great my project is? You don't want to complain about an unfair score. You don't want to ask them what score they need to get funded. Those are certainly questions that are best just to avoid. Now, there have been some changes in how NIH has been scored, and I'm sure this is not new to the majority of you, but I just wanted to quickly go over the fact that now NIH is using a three-factor framework for scoring. Their first factor or importance of the project is a combination of significance and innovation. Factor two is a combination of that rigor and feasibility coming from the approach. And then factor three, the expertise and resources, is a combination of investigator and environment, but it's not scored. It's just identified as either being sufficient or insufficient, or gaps identified. And that change was designed to reduce the emphasis on an institute's reputation or on an investigator's reputation and focus the reviewers on core research merits, de-emphasizing a bias towards well-known investigators and institutions. This is still relatively new, so we don't know how well it's all playing out, but in general, that was the idea behind it. And I think that does work well, again, from coming from these idea states. You've probably heard changes in NIH as a result of the shutdown, and I'd like to certainly just cover that very quickly as well. There were more than 370 canceled study sections, tens of thousands of application reviews were rescheduled. So to address this backlog, reviewers and the scoring process have been altered, where now the top 1/3 receive full discussion, review scoring, and a summary statement. Typically, that was more like the top half. The middle third are still eligible for funding, but aren't being discussed at the panel level. So they won't receive an impact score, but a program officer can still fund these applications. And I think this is something that, again, states like ours can benefit from because it's broadening the net. Now the program officer can work with the top 2/3 of a grant pool potentially to fund if there's institutional and center interest there. The bottom 1/3 still not discussed, not considered for funding, and there's not much that we can do with that. As a side product of this, we are now seeing simplified summary statements. So the NIH is issuing shortened summary statements that consist of a consensus sentence, bullet points that describe the major score driving factors, and then you do receive your assigned reviewers written critiques like you normally would, but these reviewers are reviewing a lot more than they typically are, so they're going to be more overworked, so you can probably expect those written critiques to be somewhat briefer. So that's sort of just a general overview as to what I've learned both writing and submitting grants and serving on study sections, to give you sort of that inside look as to what I think is going on in the mind of the reviewer. And the sort of key takeaways from that is certainly that grant writing is a skill. The more you do it, the better you're going to get. It can be learned. The earlier you can start and really focus on clarity and structure in your grant writing, that's going to pay off and allow reviewers to really extract what they need to from the grant. I certainly encourage people to get early feedback. You want to write these things as early as possible before the deadline and send them around to get feedback from your colleagues. Mock reviews, mentorship can be really important and help with these things as someone that's being identified that you can go to get that feedback when necessary. So these are all things, of course, that the professional development core within Transcend is there to provide that support. So I would definitely recommend everyone to take advantage of that. You have a great deal of expertise and people that really know what they're doing involved in that professional development core that I think can really help elevate grants with those things in mind. And the last thing that I want to say is that, again, no one writes a perfect grant. I have yet to do it. I have never read a perfect grant, but writing a fundable grant is certainly something that's possible and something that you can learn. So don't be disheartened with those initial comments and critiques and things. It's definitely attainable. And with that, I'd be happy to open things up to any questions that people might have.
Lee, hi, it's Gary Schwartz.
Hi,
Um,
Gary.
I want everyone to know that Lee is a graduate of the Dakota, and if he weren't in the wrong state, we would be loving to have more of you. That was awesome. That was awesome. You hit on so many things and wonderfully expressed and clear. I have almost nothing to add, but I, I would just say that a lot of grant writing is sort of ossified common sense. And that I agree 100% that the specific aims is the money shot. That's where you hit or you don't. And basically, if I could spin down the specific aims into sort of even more common parlance, the specific aims is simply a way of saying that you get one shot at a good first impression. If you don't nail it there, reviewers will never be more enthusiastic about the rest of the application. Also, I understand the reticence about portraying yourself as an expert. Get over it. Um, again, Hillel said it best, if I am not for myself, who is for me? You need to be able to be an expert of your own skills. And the way to think of the specific aims page, I think, is that it is an elaborate, because it's one whole page, it is an elevator pitch. And again, the mechanism is that the metaphor, you get into an elevator with the head of the corporation. She, of course, is going to the top floor. You're getting off at the mailroom, so you don't have very much time. You've got 30 seconds or 60 seconds. And what you need to explain is who you are, what it's important, why what you're studying is important, why you can fix a problem in this important endeavor, and why it's so important that we fix it now. Because if there's no urgency, there's no need to respond. And again, if you can get the specific aims page to be the standalone that you mentioned, everything else is going to fall into place. So thank you for a wonderful presentation.
No, I agree with everything that you just said, and I think the ability to use some more common terminology is definitely appreciated. But no,
I'm just trying to dumb it down for myself, not for anybody else.
Lee, this is Steve, and I also thought it was a really nice overview. And I want to hone in on one thing that really resonated with me, and that is helping grant writers really get their head around the notion that they're writing to an audience, and the audience is three reviewers. And and I think my question is, have you discovered ways or thought about ways that we can help each other really start to embrace that instead of writing grants which highlight, how great my ideas are, or if the reviewers are smart enough, they should be able to understand it. Doesn't really matter. The question is, how do we help them to appreciate it? And I'm curious, thoughts about that?
yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the key there, and you sort of hinted at it, is making it accessible. So these three reviewers that are going to be assigned, their particular expertise may be tangential to your research project. They'll have a fairly good understanding because they're on that study section, but they're not going to be an expert in what you do. So what you want to avoid is certainly what you were saying, where you're beating them over the head with all of this technical expertise and this fancy jargon. And we often think that if we can convince everyone as to how brilliant this design is, it's going to do well with reviewers. I think it's actually the opposite, because you don't know who those three individuals are, and your job as a grant writer is to have them become advocates for your grant. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to take components of your grant and put it directly into their review. And part of that is echoing the RFA in its statements. Part of that is echoing the review criteria, but all of it is making it really, really accessible, making the job of the reviewer as easy as it can be, where they don't have to go searching for whatever it is that you're talking about and becoming an expert in the methods. You need enough detail to convince them that you know what you're doing, but you don't need to beat them over the head with your technical brilliance. So I think, again, making it accessible to a broader audience of reviewers is important. And that directly stems from the fact that there are going to be those three, really only two that are reading it with the expectation of having to make comments on it. The tertiary reviewer usually just cruises by and says, I have nothing to add. So I think you really have the two chances to bring those people on board and convince them, again, to make their job easy to be an advocate for your project.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Lee, I would just add that for the third reviewer, sometimes I would not skimp at all on the statistics, because often the third reviewer is not a content person, but is somebody who can evaluate whether or not you have the power to reject the null hypothesis, or to actually provide a definitive answer to the defined question that you have in mind. So that person can be influential, even though she or he may not be a subject matter person, and say, well, I'm not sure that this method can actually, for example, reject the null. In which case that will temper people's enthusiasm in the wrong direction.
No, absolutely. No, that is a good point. You want to make sure that your work with your biostatistics score. Make sure that they are providing you with enough information, if you don't have it off the top of your head, to convince the reviewers that if you complete what you say you're going to complete, you're in a position to actually answer that question, which is essentially what that power analysis and what the experimental design is doing. Because you're right, what you don't want to have happen is a statistical savvy reviewer to read it over and say, well, even if things worked out exactly the way that they say, they're still grossly underpowered, and there's a good chance that they're going to have their type 2 error, and now what do we learn from this? So yeah, that's a great point.
Lee, we look forward to picking your brain in future. It's clearly a very fertile field.
Oh, happy to continue to be involved in any way that you feel is useful.
Thanks, Lee.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Baugh? If not, I guess thank you all for attending today, and a special thanks to Dr. Baugh. That was an outstanding presentation, and we hope to see everybody again on March 10th, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.